Dobrý večer, dámy a páni. Predtým, než oficiálne začneme, tak vás chcem upozorniť a poprosiť, nasledujúce podujatie a takisto aj môj úvodný vstup bude v angličtine. Ak by ste teda potrebovali a využili, tak tam vzadu pri tej červenej páske máme rádiostaničky, do ktorých vám bude simultánne všetko tlmočené, takže v tejto chvíli pripomínam, že sú tu k dispozícii pre vás. Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, good evening and welcome to Bratislava Hanus Days Festival, where we aim to discuss the topics at the intersection between Christianity and today's society. The following event will feature one of our keynote speakers, Mr. Dreher, and he will deliver a speech about his latest book, Live Not by Lives, which Slovak translation is coming this fall, with the main focus being put on our very own Silvester Krčméry. Before we begin, let me briefly summarize all that you need to know. The festival is brought to you by Ladislav Hanus Fellowship, the Catholic Academic Fellowship that is open for all the ones searching the truth, and you can become a member of the fellowship by enrolling in one of our formation academic programs. All the information needed can be found on our website slh.sk, slh.sk. We would like to thank our partners. The main ones are company Plout and law firm Lisina Roško and Partners. I'd like to also thank the mayor of Bratislava Old Town that took patronage over the festival and allowed us to host the festival in this beautiful space of Palfi Palace Garden. Our thanks go to main media partners Denník Štandard, Nové mesto and konzervatívny denník Postoj. In SLH we often say one can change the world but cannot do that alone. If you like to join our mission and help us to change the world, please consider supporting our cause by joining our crowdfunding campaign that we have launched, and you'll find more information about supporting the festival online, bhd.sk. You can participate in today's event by using Slido and the password BHD21. And last but not least, thank you for keeping valid pandemic measures, and please carry on with it. Even though we are currently outside, the festival is still a mass event, and therefore please wear your face mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. And now please welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Dreher, and the host, Mr. Jaroslav Daniška, with a big round of applause.
Dobrý večer, ďakujeme za privítanie. Nalejem nášmu hosťovi pohár vína. Prosím? Ako ti víno? Aký druh? Veltlin. Ešte raz dobrý večer, ďakujeme, že ste prišli. Rod Dreher je už aj na Slovensku dobre známy americký konzervatívny publicista, pravoslávny kresťan, ktorý napísal novú knihu. Pred rokom mu vyšla nová kniha Nežiť v lži, ktorá je vlastne takou najväčšou poklonou Slovákom a slovenským kresťanom a slovenskému príbehu v Amerike. Ja si myslím, že urobil pre Slovákov to, čo urobil Gandalf pre hobitov. Ukázal nám svetu a you did what Gandalf did for hobbits, you did the same for Slovaks. A my sa tomu strašne tešíme. Dnes teda myslím, že budeme čerpať aj z tej knihy, že nám ukáže, ako veľmi ho oslovil Silvester Krčméry. A urobíme to tak, že Rod bude mať najskôr prednášku a potom otvoríme diskusiu. Máme pre vás pripravený aj jeden darček spolu s kolegami, ktorí vedia obsluhovať tú obrazovku, tak by som ich poprosil, aby nám pustili jeden klip. Ten klip vznikol pre dnešnú večernú reláciu Do kríža a budeme ho zajtra postovať aj na Facebooky a keď ho budete chcieť zdieľať na svojich sieťach alebo dať ďalším ľuďom na zdieľanie, tak to urobte, lebo má to byť vlastne taká poklona Silvestrovi Krčmérymu. Sú to úryvky z toho jeho slávneho prejavu, ktorý sme kvôli tomu zajtrajšiemu významnému dňu sviatku nahrali. Takže poprosím teraz, pozdravujem aj Timoteja Kryšku, ktorý bol kameraman toho a Slavo Zrebný bol režisér. A teraz poprosím réžiu, aby nám pustila ten klip, tým by sme začali.
Keď mi bolo udelené posledné slovo na moju obhajobu, tak musím zdôrazniť, že na svoju obranu neuvádzam nič. Čo som uviedol som len na obranu skutočnosti a pravdy. Keď som počas vyšetrovania odmietal vypovedať, bolo to len preto, lebo som videl, že vyšetrovacie orgány nechcú pravdu poznať, ale chcú ju prekrútiť. Som presvedčený, že v tom, z čoho som žalovaný, mám čisté svedomie pred Bohom i pred ľuďmi. A ak za to, čo som robil, to jest za dobro, pravdu a Krista, mám byť trestaný, vtedy nie len, že nechcem menší trest, ale chcem radšej väčší. A bol by som najšťastnejší, kebyže môžem za Krista i zomrieť. Hoci viem, že takej veľkej milosti nie som hodný. Hoci my ľudí nerozdeľujeme ani podľa tried, ani podľa kabáta, ani podľa majetku, ale každý človek je pre nás druhým Kristom. My sa predsa ani takto nedáme strhnúť k nenávisti, rebelovaniu ani reptaniu. O tom môžu už teraz svedčiť stovky ľudí. Práve v tom je naša sila a prevaha. My sa aj za zlo vieme dobrom odplácať. Od prvej chvíle sa za vás všetkých dennodenne modlíme. Nie ako si to jeden vyšetrujúci referent ironicky vysvetľoval, aby vás čerti brali. Ale naopak, aby vám Boh odpustil všetky chyby a hriechy, lebo naozaj nechápete dosah toho, čo robíte proti Bohu a cirkvi. I za tých, čo nás bili a ponižovali, obmedzovali a trápili metódami nervového a duševného nátlaku pri dlhodobej samoväzbe, znemožnením zamestnania i čítania, vychádzok, návštev i dopisovania. Niekedy i zamedzením sedenia a spánku. Usilovali na nás dosiahnuť nervové a duševné zrútenie a vynútiť skreslené alebo nepravdivé výpovede proti Kristovi a cirkvi. Alebo spolukamarátov. Rozhodol som sa preto svedčiť z povinnosti. Musím vydávať svedectvo o pravde. Vy máte v rukách moc. Ale my máme pravdu. A tú moc vám nezávidíme a netúžime po nej. Nám stačí tá pravda, lebo pravda je väčšia a silnejšia ako moc. A ten, kto má v rukách moc, si myslí, že môže pravdu potlačiť, zabiť alebo ukrižovať. No pravda dosiaľ vždy vstala a i vstane z mŕtvych.
Stále sa pri tom chvejeme, že? Ladies and gentlemen, now please welcome Rod Dreher, and floor is yours, Rod. Yes, sure, it's yours.
Thank you, Jaro, and thank you, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be back in Bratislava, where 2 years ago I spoke at the Hanus Days Festival and started doing research for my book, Live Not by Lies. The book appeared in the US last fall and has become a big bestseller. It's now beginning to appear in Europe. It's already published in France, Spain, and Romania, and will soon be in Slovakia and many other countries. It is my great honor to tell in the pages of my book the story of some of the great heroes of the 21st century, Slovak heroes of the underground church that resisted communism. In fact, I dedicated Live Not by Lies to the memory of the Croatian priest, Father Tomislav Kolakovic, who came to your country in 1943 as a fugitive from the Nazis, and who warned anyone who would listen that the Soviets were going to rule Slovakia after the war ended. Father Kolakovic said that the first thing the communists would do would be to persecute the church. He told his followers that they needed to start preparing now for persecution. The bishops of his time chastised him, telling Father Kolakovic that he was being alarmist. But this did not deter him. Within 2 years, Father Kolakovic and his followers had formed a network of believers all over Slovakia. When the communists seized control of the country, one of their first acts was to persecute the church, just as Father Kolakovic had predicted. The network of believers the Croatian priests set up became the backbone of the underground church, which was the only meaningful Slovak resistance to communism for the next 40 years. I believe that today, over 30 years after the fall of communism, that we all face another Kolakovic moment. That is, I believe we are living in a time before the arrival of a different kind of totalitarianism. There will be persecution. In fact, it is already starting in some places, such as in Finland, as we saw earlier. I believe that Christians and all people of goodwill should begin planning the resistance right now, just as the Slovak Catholics who followed Father Kolakovic did in the 1940s. Let me explain why. 6 years ago, I received a phone call from an American physician who was rather alarmed. He told me that his mother emigrated to America from Czechoslovakia. When she was young, she served 6 years as a political prisoner because she was part of the underground Catholic resistance to communism. Now, as an old lady living with her son and his wife, she said to her son, "The things I'm seeing in this country today remind me of when communism first came to my homeland." She was talking about the growing intolerance, even hysteria from the left against anything that conflicts with their ideology. I knew that political correctness was a big problem, but this sounded exaggerated to me. Maybe she's just a frightened old woman, I thought. But over the next few years, I began talking to immigrants from the Soviet bloc, men and women who once lived with communism, but who escaped to the West. I would ask them, "What are you seeing today? Is this old Czech woman correct?" Over and over, I heard the same thing. Yes, it is really happening here. We can feel it in our bones. And almost all of them are angry that no American believes them. Well, I understand the skepticism. I was skeptical too when the doctor first called me. Today, though, after interviewing a number of these people and traveling throughout the former communist countries of the East to interview former dissidents and political prisoners, I am convinced that they're right. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "There is always this fallacious belief. It would not be the same here. Such things are impossible." Alas, all of the evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. It is not only possible in the liberal democratic West, but it is actually taking form right now. People who lived through communist totalitarianism are trying to sound the alarm. They're trying to wake the rest of us up before it's too late. As Marek Benda, a Czech politician who comes from a dissident family, told me in Prague, the fight for freedom is always with us. Only one generation divides us from tyranny. The fight against the new totalitarianism is the fight of our generation. It is here, it is now, and it cannot be avoided. Before we go further, let's define our term. What is totalitarianism? In her classic 1951 study, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt examined both the Nazi and the communist movements in an attempt to discern why they appealed to the masses. Totalitarianism makes every aspect of life political. It not only seeks obedience from the people, but it attempts to force everyone to welcome their own oppression. We have to internalize the ruling ideology and make it our own. As George Orwell put it, the goal is for everyone to learn to love Big Brother. Many of the conditions that Arendt saw as the seedbed of totalitarianism are present today in our decaying liberal democracies. Most important of all is the spread of mass loneliness and social atomization. But also important, according to Arendt, is a widespread loss of faith in institutions and hierarchies, as well as an urge to transgress just for the fun of seeing things destroyed. Arendt said these factors were common in pre-totalitarian Russia and Germany. I can't speak about Europe, but we are definitely seeing the same things in America today. And as we know, what happens in America is eventually going to happen in Europe. As I see it, though, we have two basic things that distinguish us from pre-communist Russia and pre-Nazi Germany. First, the all-consuming ideology among us is not racist nationalism or Marxism-Leninism, but rather a globalist, victim-focused identity politics, often called social justice. The revolutionary class is not the German Volk or the international proletariat, but the marginalized and the oppressed, the sacred victim. Like Bolshevism, social justice is a utopian political cult. It sounds like a political platform or maybe a therapeutic management system, but the best way to understand it is as a fanatical religion. Second, the technological environment today is vastly different than 100 years ago, when the 20th century's totalitarianisms emerged. The most important difference now is that we render all of human life and experience as digital data that is storable, searchable, and that can be exploited by surveillance states and the surveillance capitalists of Google, Amazon, and others. The People's Republic of China, for example, now has the capabilities and the will to surveil and control its own people to a degree which Mao, Stalin, and the totalitarian tyrants of the 20th century could only have dreamed. Here's why so many of us have been very slow to appreciate the totalitarian nature of contemporary liberalism. It's because the emerging totalitarianism is not going to be a version of the grim scenario imagined by George Orwell in 1984. Rather, it's going to be more like the alternative dystopia imagined by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. Orwell imagined a world very much like Stalin's Russia, where the state controls society by fear, pain, and terror. By contrast, Huxley imagined a world where the state controlled the masses through managing pleasure and comfort. Western people, I believe, will surrender political power to a state and to authorities who promise to protect their therapeutic desires, especially maximizing sexual freedom. I believe it will do this through some version of China's social credit system, where one's freedom in society is decided by an algorithm that rewards or punishes one based on one's belief, one's friends, and so forth. As in Brave New World, the most important values will be safety and well-being. If religious and political liberties threaten either, then they will have to be eliminated. This is already happening within universities and other institutions that, in a very Soviet way, are stigmatizing dissent as pathological. In my country, we're now seeing a generation of Americans willing to see religious liberty, free speech, and other important political freedoms taken away from us for the sake of creating a safe, tightly managed society where nobody has to feel anxious or sad. A college professor once told me that he quit teaching Brave New World because almost none of his students considered it to be a dystopia. They all thought Huxley's soft totalitarianism sounded like paradise. These elites of the younger generations will usher in what the American social critic James Poulos calls the pink police state. The pink police state, which includes the government, academic and cultural institutions, as well as large corporations, is the form that the new totalitarianism is taking. This is soft totalitarianism. No secret police, no torture, no gulags, but totalitarianism all the same. If, for example, you are a university professor who expresses even mild criticism of gender ideology, the state will not care. But your students will probably denounce you, your university will fire you, and you might never work in academia again. And this is how you can have a form of totalitarianism within a liberal democracy. So how do we resist? The good news is that there are people who retain living memory of communist totalitarianism. They have seen this kind of thing before. They're warning the rest of us that we're walking into a trap. We need to listen to them. There is a critically important political and legal aspect of this resistance, but I want to talk tonight about cultural resistance, without which political and legal resistance can only bring temporary victories. First, we have to reclaim and defend cultural memory. When the Nazis invaded Poland, their ultimate plans were not simply to rule Poland, but to destroy the Polish nation. The Germans sought to do this the way all totalitarians do, by controlling the cultural memory of the Polish people. They had to make the Poles forget their history and forget their religion. A young Polish actor, Karol Wojtyła, committed himself to patriotic resistance, but he didn't pick up a gun. He and his theater friends wrote and performed underground plays on religious and historical themes. These theatrical events happened in secret. If the Gestapo had discovered them, all the actors and all the audience would have been shot. Wojtyła and the theater company literally put their lives on the line to keep alive the cultural memory of their nation. We have to do the same in our own time. The globalists try to make people in the different nations ashamed of their heritage in the same way the communists did to the masses that they wish to control. We have to refuse this. We do not have to believe in the triumphalist myth of a past golden age. We only have to look around us with eyes of gratitude for the good and beautiful things that our ancestors have given to us and defend them as our own. I should add that the ideology of consumer capitalism tries to disconnect us from our past. If we are nothing but individuals defined by our own desires, it's easier to sell us things. We of the resistance must declare that some things are not for sale. Second, we must establish and defend solidarity. I'm not talking specifically about the Polish trade union. I'm talking about something more intimate, the bonds among small groups of people. In every post-communist country I visited for my book, I heard the same thing from former dissidents, that the strong bonds of solidarity with others gave them the courage to fight back. 2 years ago, I stood in a secret underground room here in Bratislava where Catholic samizdat was printed for a decade. My guide was Jan Samulchik, a historian who in the 1980s was part of the underground who distributed that samizdat. He told me that like everybody else in the movement, he was afraid, but the camaraderie of his friends gave him the courage to keep going. Dr. Václav Benda, a hero of the Czech resistance, worked to bring the Czech people together face to face, to remind them that they actually were a people. The state demoralized the masses by making them feel isolated and alone. As Dr. Benda saw, the simple act of rebuilding social solidarity was counter-revolutionary. In our time, the state doesn't force us to choose loneliness and isolation behind a glowing screen. We do this to ourselves. We can fight back by rebuilding the bonds of community in practical ways. Third, we have to strengthen our religion. I don't simply mean that we have to go to church more often. Rather, we have to be far more radical than that. In my book, The Benedict Option, I write about St. Benedict of Nursia, the 6th century Christian who responded to the collapse of the Roman imperial order by creating a parallel society dedicated to disciplined prayer and service to God. Over the next few centuries, the Benedictine monks played an absolutely key role in civilizing barbarian Europe. It began, though, with St. Benedict developing a Christian way of life that was resilient in the face of the extraordinary stresses of the early medieval period. Last year, on a visit to Italy, I made a pilgrimage to the cave in Subiaco, where Benedict lived alone for 3 years as a hermit, praying and fasting and seeking the will of God. From that little hole in the side of a lonely mountain grew a seed of faith that, over the next centuries, would rebuild Western civilization. If you ever feel powerless and despairing about what's happening in the world, go to Subiaco and see what God can do with a single man who puts the search for him above everything else. Today, we live in a post-Christian civilization. Right now, while there is time, Christians at the local level, must commit themselves to creating new ways of living out old truths. Every one of the anti-communist dissidents I interviewed were strongly believing Christians. Pavel Skibinski, a biographer of John Paul II, told me that humanity is like a kite. As long as the kite is connected to the earth by a string, it can fly very high. But if that line is cut, the kite falls to the ground. We are the kite. The line is our connection to God. Without the God of the Bible, we will not be able to resist both the coming totalitarianism or the parallel temptation to embrace evil forms of resistance. Finally, we must do the most counter-revolutionary thing of all in the modern world: embrace the value of suffering. This strikes at the heart of the pink police state and its therapeutic totalitarianism. If you're not willing to suffer the loss of social status, if you're not willing to suffer the loss of a job, if you're not willing to suffer the loss of freedom, and if it comes to it, even your life, for the sake of truth, then you've already surrendered to evil. This is the lesson we learn from the anti-communist resistance. The essence of their Christian hope was that suffering has ultimate meaning if it is joined to the transformative passion of Jesus Christ. When I was in Bratislava for the first time, I learned about the late Dr. Silvester Krčméry, a Catholic layman and an architect of the underground church. My Slovak friends gave me a copy of his 1996 memoir titled "This Saved Us," in which Dr. Krčméry explained how he and the other Christian prisoners survived their captivity and torture. In the book, Dr. Krčméry says that he resolved from the moment of his arrest never, ever to feel sorry for himself. He had every reason to pity himself, but he knew that if he did so, he would not have the strength to carry on. Dr. Krčméry received his prison sentence as an opportunity to share in the suffering of Christ. He wrote that he saw himself as, quote, God's probe there in the prison. Suffering was a chance to deepen his own repentance and to build bonds of love and solidarity with the other prisoners. This is absolutely vital wisdom for us, for all of us, as we prepare for the coming darkness. And it is, in fact, vital wisdom for us in our everyday struggles. I hope I can talk more about that in our conversation. The willingness to suffer for the truth is at the core of the final message Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave to the Russian people on the eve of his 1974 exile in an essay titled "Live Not by Lies." This is where I get the title of my book. A few years later, Václav Havel urged his readers to, quote, live in truth. Havel told a fable about a greengrocer who has the sign, "Workers of the World Unite," in his shop window, not because he believes the slogan, but because he doesn't want trouble. One day, he removes the sign from his window because he wants to live in truth. And this man will suffer for it, says Havel. He might lose his business. He will not be able to travel. His children might not get into universities. The pain will be real, but his act will have ultimate value. The humble greengrocer will have shown that it is possible to refuse to conform to the official lies. It is possible to live in truth. The life of Václav Havel, the first president of a free Czechoslovakia and of the other anti-communist dissidents, shows that those who are willing to suffer for the truth might, in the end, triumph. Very few dissidents expected communism to end in their lifetime. They resisted communism because it was the right thing to do. Well, what about us? What are we going to do in our time and place? The pink police state is kinder and gentler than its totalitarian predecessors, but in its ideology of globalist homogenization and technological reach, it is no less a threat to the existence of religion, of families, of tradition, and of peoples. Yes, we have to fight it politically when we can, but we must also fight it inside ourselves. My friends, one way to define hope is the marriage of memory with desire. If we can remember what we once had and desire to have it again, then we have something to hope for. You are all Christians and Europeans. You will be told by the globalists, by the ideologues, and the progressives that you should be ashamed of your faith and your civilization. You will be told that we can only make progress when we bury this past and look forward to a future free from religion, free from national particularity, and from any prejudices that stand in the way of liberating the individual will. I urge you to refuse and resist these lies. The only hope we have is in Christ and in the traditions that our ancestors have given to us. Let us reclaim them. From St. Benedict's cave in Subiaco to Wojtyła's hidden theater under German occupation to the underground Samizdat room right here in Bratislava, these are all part of our cultural memory. Let these memories shape our desires for God, for truth, for liberty, and for home. And may they give birth to the joy of resistance. Now, there will be some people today who say about me the same thing that the bishops back then said about Father Kolakovich, that I'm being alarmist, that totalitarianism can't happen in 21st century Europe. And you know what? I hope they're right. I don't want my children to live under soft totalitarianism. But let me end tonight by suggesting to you that even if you doubt that soft totalitarianism is coming, there are still important lessons to learn about life today, lessons taught by the lives of your fellow Slovaks who lived through the terror, men like Silvester Krčméry. I want to tell you tonight a story about another Slovak, a friend I made when I first came to your country. He taught me something about how to live. He's here tonight with us. His name is Timotej Kriška. He's a photographer who lives and works here in Bratislava. Though he was only a toddler when communism ended, Timo knows about the suffering of Christians under communism better than most. His great-grandfather, a Greek Catholic priest, was forced out of ministry in the 1950s for refusing the government's order to convert to the Orthodox Church, which at that time was under Soviet control. That priest, Father Michael Durishin, chose a life of suffering for himself and his family rather than stain his conscience. Well, several years ago, Timo set out to honor his ancestors' sacrifice by interviewing and photographing the still living Slovak survivors of communist persecution, including original members of Father Kolakovich's fellowship called The Family. He published his interviews and photographs in a book called Light and Darkness. You can still get this book. Well, as he made his rounds around Slovakia, Timo was shaken up not by the stories of suffering that he heard, these he expected, but rather by the intense inner peace radiating from these elderly believers. These men and women had been around Timo's age when they had everything taken from them but their faith in God. And yet, over and over, they told Timo that in prison, they found inner liberation through suffering. One Christian, separated from his wife and 5 children and cast into solitary confinement, testified that he had moments then that were, quote, like paradise. Timo said to me, it seemed that the less they were able to change the world around them, the stronger they had become. These people completely changed my understanding of freedom. My project changed from looking for victims to finding heroes. I stopped building a monument to the unjust past. I began to look for a message for us, the free people, unquote. Well, the message Timo found was this. The secular liberal idea of freedom, so popular in the West and among many in his post-communist generation, that's a lie. That is, the concept that real freedom is found by liberating the self from all binding commitments to God, to marriage, to family, and by increasing worldly comforts, that is a road that leads to hell. Timo observed that the only force in society standing in the middle of that wide road yelling, stop, were the traditional Christian churches. And then it hit him. He said to me, with our eyes fixed intently on the West, we could see how it was beginning to experience the same things we knew from the time of totalitarianism. Once again, we are all being told that Christian values stand in the way of the people having a better life. History has already shown us how far this kind of thing can go. We also know what to do now in terms of making life decisions. From his interviews with former Christian prisoners, Timo also learned something important about himself. He had always thought that suffering was something to be escaped, yet he never understood why the easier and freer his professional and personal life became, his happiness did not commensurately increase. His generation was the first one since the Second World War in this country to know liberty. So why did he feel so anxious and never satisfied? These meetings with the elderly dissidents revealed a life-giving truth to the seeker. It was the same truth it took Alexander Solzhenitsyn a tour through the hell of the Soviet Gulag to learn. Accepting suffering is the beginning of our liberation, Timo says. Suffering can be a great source of strength. It gives us the power to resist. It is a gift from God that invites us to change, to start a revolution against the oppression. But for me, again, this is Timo talking, but for me, the oppressor was no longer the totalitarian communist regime. It's not even the progressive liberal state. Meeting these hidden heroes started a revolution against the greatest totalitarian ruler of all, myself. Timo discovered a subtle but immensely important truth. We ourselves are the ultimate rulers of our consciences. Hard totalitarianism depends on terrorizing us into surrendering our free consciences. Soft totalitarianism uses fear as well, but mostly it bewitches us with the therapeutic promises of entertainment, pleasure, and comfort, including, in the phrase of the dictator in Brave New World, quote, Christianity without tears. But truth cannot be separated from tears. To live in truth requires accepting suffering. This is the cost of liberty. This is what it means to live in truth. There is no other way. There is no escape from the struggle. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, first of all, over our own hearts. When Live Not by Lies was published in America, one reviewer said the book introduces American readers to heroes of the Cold War whose names would have been lost to history. Among those people are Father Tomislav Kolakovich, Dr. Silvester Krčméry, František Mikloško, Jan Čarnogorsky, Jan Samulchik, Father Vladimir Yukol, Vladimir Palko, Cardinal Jan Chrysostom Koretz, and so many more. Some of these men are still alive today. Their testimonies and experiences are God's gift to all of us, please cherish them. Everyone in this place tonight can follow the same path as Timo Kriška. Remember your history, dear Slovaks. Remember who you are. During the Cold War, many of you looked to the West for hope and for help. Today, we, your Christian brothers and sisters in the West, are looking to you and to your history and to men like Silvester Krčméry. Thank you for coming tonight to hear me, and may God bless Slovakia.
Thank you very much, Rod. I ask two questions, and then I will open the debate. If you have questions, you can send them to Slido, but I prefer direct questions, so if you can raise just the hand, I will prefer questions from audience. Chesterton compared American soul, American mentality to that of church. You said in your remarks that we need to strengthen the religion. What is the state of religion in the United States today? How strong it is? And what happened to that mentality of church? Is it still true in America?
Well, it's a difficult question to ask or to answer in Europe because the church in America is much stronger in terms of attendance than it is in most European countries. But the church is in fact quite weak, and right now the generation of my son, who's 21 years old, that's going to be the first generation of American history in which a majority are not affiliated with the church or any religion. What's happened to the church is that we have grown decadent from comfort. In my book, The Benedict Option, I talked about how the research of a man named Christian Smith, he's a professor, a sociologist at Notre Dame University, and he talked about how the basic belief of most Americans, whatever their church or confession, is what he calls moralistic therapeutic deism. It believes a few basic things. God exists, he wants us to be happy, he wants us to be nice, and the only people who go to hell are really bad people like Hitler. Otherwise, it's a free-for-all. You can do whatever you want. Well, this is not the same thing as the Christianity of the Bible. This is not what any church has ever taught us, but this is what Americans have come to believe. And I know it's true because I was raised in the 1970s in a version of this that was maybe a little more morally conservative, but we didn't take Scripture that seriously. We thought that Christianity was a nice psychological comfort for us, for a psychological comfort to our middle-class lives. So I think this is why the church has become so weak in America, is we took it for granted. We thought that this would always last. And the parents, my parents' generation, my generation with our kids, so many of us have not taught the faith to our children, not taught it in any kind of sacrificial way. And so we shouldn't be surprised when our kids are falling away from it. We've not taught them that the faith was anything important or countercultural, or that the faith could not be reconciled with a comfortable middle-class American life. And this is why I think, too, that we don't have a lot of courage in the face of persecution, the persecution that's starting now of people who don't, Christians and others who don't agree with the woke, we call it woke, left-wing values, because we have no theology for suffering. We've become so comfortable. Our priests and pastors in every church have failed to talk about the importance of suffering. This is something that is absolutely central to the Christian life. Our Lord died on the cross, suffered and died on the cross. This should be second nature to Christians, but it's not, you know. And I think we're seeing the fallout from that. It's also true that so much religion has gotten caught up with politics on the left and the right. You hear a lot in the media about the way a lot of evangelical Christians supported Donald Trump and how they corrupted the gospel with that. And I think there's something to that. But you never hear in the media about the equal problem on the left of so much progressive religion being corrupted by progressive politics, LGBT, Black Lives Matter. I think Americans on both left and right have substituted religion, politics for a real religion. Finally, I think that what we call wokeness, this passionate social justice passion, which is not a passion for social justice as the Catholic Church understands it, but rather a passion for Black Lives Matter, for gender ideology, things like that. It is believed by the young with the force of a fundamentalist religion. In fact, you can understand it best by thinking about it as a kind of secular religion that is incredibly intolerant. When I was doing research for my book, I read about the Bolsheviks, the early Bolsheviks, and I was really impressed by the fact that they were really an apocalyptic millennial political cult. You know, they believed what they believed with the force of a fundamentalist religion. You could not argue with them. The woke in my country are the same way. You absolutely can't argue with them. And I think that young people who are raised without any kind of real authentic religion, they're looking for something to believe in. They're looking for what traditional religion is supposed to give you, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose in life, and a sense of solidarity. Well, churches have forgotten how to do that. And so this wokeness, this crazy political cult, has rushed in to fill the void. And we find ourselves in America now, the church is facing a rival religion, but it doesn't really know what to do about it.
Even though you touch it, I still have a question why. What happened to that younger generation, that progressive generation? It's present here as well, but it's much weaker. In the United States, it's strong, it's powerful. As you said, they accept LGBT identities. Over 20% of the young generation accept different sexual identities. That's much more than we ever heard from liberal media. They are much less religious. What's the engine behind? Why it happened? Whose fault?
Yeah, well, I think it happens because when the left came forward with all this new talk about gay marriage, transgender, and all that, it played into some very powerful beliefs that have been long present in the American mind. Most of all, the belief that you can be whatever you want to be, that you are your own creation, that, I mean, think about it, the people who left Europe to immigrate to America, and this still happens from all around the world, one of the reasons they came there is looking to start over in life, to find more freedom. We in America tend to define freedom as the absence of constraints. You know, nobody knows who your family was when you immigrate to America. You don't have the heavy weights from the old world. You're free to start your new life. And in the American psyche, this has been a normal thing. And so when people come forward saying that you should do whatever you need to do to feel good about yourself, people naturally accept it. We have, over the course of the 20th century, we have become highly psychologized. We have gone from being a society where people thought about right and wrong in terms of religion and traditional morality, and rather we tend to think of right or wrong in terms of what makes you feel good versus what makes you feel anxious. And so naturally, we have reached the end of this road in which people say that, that if something makes them feel anxious, they can't deal with it. It's an attack on them. I'll tell you a true story, and this tells you a lot about where America is and where it's headed. A couple of years ago, I was in Boston on business, and I remember that I had a European friend there, an Italian journalist who was studying at Harvard University. He was on a special program where he could take graduate courses. I called him, and he said that he was about to go back to Italy. His course was over. I said, well, can we have lunch? I want to find out what you learned at Harvard. I mean, this is a great opportunity, one of the world's best universities. So over lunch, I asked him, so what's the most important lesson you learned at Harvard? And he looked at me and said, how fragile the American elite are. I said, wait, what do you mean by that? Well, he said that in his classes at Harvard, when they started class, professors would commonly say to people, class, today we are not going to talk about this subject and this subject because some of you came to me before class and said that it would be to make you feel unsafe if we talked about it. So we're going to just ignore that today. My Italian journalist friend said, we in the class who are from Europe looked at each other like, wait, is this serious? But it was serious. And it wasn't just that one class. This kept happening in class after class after class. My friend said that he recognized that these Americans who were going to be the next elite, the next generation, because they were going to the most important college, that they were so fragile they could not deal with any aspect of reality that made them feel anxious. But at the same time, none of them doubted that it was their destiny to rule the country and rule the world. So my friend's conclusion was, America is going to be run by people who are completely crazy. Seriously, that they can't deal with reality. They're too frightened of reality, but they're going to use the power they have to lock themselves off from reality and to suppress and oppress anybody who challenges their sense of what's real and their sense of safety. So that's kind of a long answer for you, but it tells you that there's something deeply psychological and weird going on in the US right now, where people, it used to be a country of strong, independent people. We have the phrase to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the rugged individual. This was America, the Marlboro man, all of that, the cowboy. This was who we once were. All of that is now being thrown in the trash, and we are becoming a total neurotic mess.
There are many American liberals who do not believe that this woke ideology can win in the United States, like Mark Lilla wrote a book about that. Edward Lewis in Financial Times often writes about that, many others, because they say that it's destined to be in a minority position. Why do you think otherwise?
Mark Lilla is a professor at Columbia University. When he wrote his book, as a liberal, criticizing this radical progressive wokeness, he was denounced by a professor at his own university as a white supremacist, which is just crazy. But this is what the culture is like now. It is like communism, when all you have to do is denounce somebody as being a white supremacist or a bigot of some sort, and you lose status. And he was hard hit by that when that happened. But so you couldn't even argue from the left against this sort of thing without paying a big price. I'm more pessimistic than Mark about it because these radicals on the left, the woke, have marched through the institutions, all the institutions of American life, and they are the gatekeepers to success. If you tell most Americans that in order to succeed professionally and to make money, you have to agree with this, most of them will do it because that's what matters more to them, is achieving middle-class professional success and protecting that status. We've had, especially during the Trump years, this accelerated. Big business and most of the institutions like media, Hollywood, academia, they've all been trending more leftward. But under the Trump years, that accelerated very quickly. And as I said in the earlier session, when big business embraced progressive politics, that it was over. The culture war was over because they're so powerful. And now it is very difficult to succeed at the executive level in businesses unless you sign off on all of this. So we have not only lost business, academia, media, Hollywood, we've also lost law and medicine. You actually have doctors now who are refusing to take certain courses because it triggers them. I mean, it's insane. It's invaded science, it's invaded engineering, it's invaded sports, as we all know, and it has even invaded the CIA. Did you see the woke CIA ad? Oh my gosh! We covered it. Yeah. Should we kind of mention it? Sure. Yeah. Very quickly. If you go on YouTube, you can see the Central Intelligence Agency has a new series of ads to recruit people to come join the CIA. And they're all woke. The first one shows a woman, she's about 35. She said, I am a cisgender, intersectional Latina with some mental disorder, and I can fully be myself at the CIA. And she goes on to use this crazy jargon that 10 years ago it was only in among a few intellectuals, relatively few intellectuals, but now the CIA is advertising how far to the left they are to try to get more recruits. So when even the CIA is woke, oh, and the US military, same thing with recruiting, you know that it has become a successor ideology to classical liberalism.
Even though I recently viewed the Komenský method, the series on Netflix, and they ridiculed it. Michael Douglas was starring in that. It was a fresh air. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Unless you don't, I will ask a few more. Stefan in the second row, and there in the back.
Okay, thank you so much, Dirot. Firstly, my compliment to your bright American English pronunciation is the best American English I have ever heard. Yeah. But okay, coming to the point, I think you are absolutely right, because this is also my wish to have Christianity without the cross. Okay, with the cross on the wall, but not in my life. And I mean hunting success and making money, etc., etc. And this is not only my problem, this is a general problem. And the situation in Slovakia is, despite of all difficulties, we are getting too fast rich. And this is affecting the belief, because if we are getting rich, we think we are autonomous and we wouldn't need God. And this is, I think, the basic problem of not just only young generation, but of the Christians in this country now. And this is more dangerous than the communist persecution, because the communist persecution was, I mean, in the front, and you could see the enemy very clearly. Now the enemy is coming from the from inside, and this is much more tricky. Yeah? Good, but I mean, the receipt is the same, is to really to rely on God, on the Jesus Christ crucified and resurrected, raised from the death. Yeah, this is the only possibility. But the question I have, what do you think, what happened in the United States, the country which was for us during the communist system a light tower of freedom, yeah? And what happened in this country that now it's turning, that the freedom is over and it's becoming more and more totalitarian. And all this, I mean, also this business against China and against Russia is a business, it's a money issue, not ideological issue. Yeah? And what's happening there, and what do you think could be the solution? But especially for the US, as you are American, but also for Western Europe. Because if this will continue, this civilization will disappear, like the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I thank you for that. In fact, your first comment reminded me of something that I was told when I was in Slovakia doing research, that a Slovak Catholic priest said that it was easier in some ways under communism, because then the light of the gospel shone very clearly through the darkness. But now the light of the gospel hits only fog, you know, and it's, as you say, it's difficult to know where the enemy is, and maybe the enemy is within us. You ask what happened to America, and that's such a difficult question because so many things happened, but I think what happened, the main thing that happened is we started confusing virtue with personal pleasure. And we started thinking of freedom as freedom from having to, any obligation outside ourselves that is not chosen. That might sound kind of abstract, but I think that so much of what we have become as a country comes from that, the idea that we don't think that we have an obligation to God, to a moral code outside ourselves, to our families, anything. We don't have an obligation to anything that we haven't chosen ourselves. And you can see this problem both on the left and on the right. And as I said in my earlier answer, I don't see most American Christianity providing a clear alternative to that. If you go and read the teachings of the church and the writings of the church fathers and all of it, Christianity does offer an answer. But for some reason, our pastors have become too timid to speak out, and the congregations don't want to hear anything that challenges them. They expect to go to church and to be told that they're already saints. They don't have to do anything. Look, I'm not just criticizing other people. I'm the same way. It's hard to die to yourself. But for me, reading about what Dr. Silvester Krčméry did and what these other brave men and women did was a real challenge. It made me stop and think, what would I be willing to suffer for the sake of the gospel? And I don't, you asked what is the answer here. I wish I had one. I look at my own country these days and I think a lot about the Spanish Civil War. In Spain, when the Republic was declared in 1931, some of the far leftists, the anarchists, started burning down convents and churches. Well, when the right came back into power as a reaction 2 years later, there was some right-wing radicalism punishing the left. It went back and forth like that until it finally got to the point where people hated each other so much they started shooting. I hope to God that doesn't happen in my country. And in fact, I expect that the government will probably institute something like the Chinese social credit system to control the population. But that would be another disaster. It sounds like a cliche, but I think there's no hope for us unless we rediscover our Christian faith in a real way. The French novelist Michel Houellebecq is not a Christian, but he wrote this famous novel a few years ago called Submission. And in it, it's set in the future in which France, the country of France, everyone is so exhausted and demoralized, they've put their Christian faith behind, that they eventually accept Islam, not because they're Muslims, they really believe in it, but because society has to have something, some organizing principle to continue on. That's what I fear most of all. In Europe, you have a problem with unassimilated Muslim immigrants. We don't really have that problem in the US, but I fear that this political radicalism of wokeness is going to be the fake religion that we organize ourselves around. Or we could see some far-right radicalism, post-Christian radicalism. Right now, we're seeing so much propaganda trying to demonize white people. We're taught all the time in corporate propaganda and academia, in the media, that to be white is a problem. We recently had a psychiatrist from New York, an Indian American, gave a talk at Yale University Medical School saying that white people are psychopathic, and she fantasizes about killing them. And she's still defending this. I mean, it's insane, but this is where we are as a country. And I keep saying in my own blog, I say to the left, you've got to stop this, because there are people on the far right who are not restrained by Christian belief, who are going to become just as radical and filled with racial hatred against non-white people. And if that happens, then we might have a civil war. That would be the nightmare scenario. I don't see any hope for us without Christ.
We have one more question in the back.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Szymon Sadowski. I would like to ask Mr. Dreher a few questions. Or I would like to challenge one claim. Mr. Dreher, you said during your talk, you said that Christians during communist regime were the only one who put the sign in the middle of the street to show everyone that this is wrong direction. I would like to challenge the word "the only" because of I know and I heard stories about the civil dissident, don't know word in English. So my question is, okay, first of all, I do not deny that the Christians were the biggest organized group who showed the biggest sign, okay. But there were people who were not Christians and also showed some signs that this direction is wrong. So
Václav Havel was one.
For example, so I would like to ask, okay, so first, obviously, you know some these stories, so this was my first question, whether you know some these stories of non-Christians in our country opposing communism. And my next question is, during these days, I also know some people who are not Christians, and are my friends, and they oppose this crazy progressivism which is in America doing things which you said. So my question is how to cooperate with these people, because obviously we cannot practice faith with them. We cannot pray together because they don't pray because they're not Christians. But I think that we need to cooperate with them, and my question is how.
Before you answer, chcel by som poprosiť Karin, či by nemohla prísť, lebo nefunguje mi mašinka. Ďakujem.
Thank you for your comments and your questions. I was speaking generally about Christianity being the only thing strong enough to stand against this evil, when it's certainly true that people like Václav Havel, who are not believers, but they stood bravely against it too. But what I had in mind was a story, a true story, about W.H. Auden. He is an English poet. You might know his work, one of the greatest English poets of the 20th century. And he was living in Manhattan in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland. And he went to see a movie at a movie theater in a German part of New York City. And they had a newsreel before the movie started, showing, it was from Germany, it was showing the Wehrmacht rolling over into Poland. People in the audience, these were German immigrants to New York, stood up and started shrieking, kill them, talking about the Poles. It scared Auden so much, he walked out of the theater onto the streets of New York, and he realized that the only power on earth strong enough to fight back against that sort of radical evil and radical hatred was Christianity, and he returned to the church. That's what I have in mind. It's not that there are no people other than Christians who stand against evil, but it's that we are going to have draw on very deep roots if we're going to keep a sustained fight against the radical evil that is coming, that is making itself known now. You ask about how can we cooperate with people who don't share our faith, but who do agree with us that we have to fight against this radical progressivism. This is an important point. Kamila Bendova, Václav Benda's wife, told me how important this was. She and her husband were the only Christians in Václav Havel's inner circle. And she said that when you find people who are brave enough to stand up and put everything at risk to speak for the truth, then you have to be their allies. Because most Christians, she said, around Prague, were not that way. They wanted to just be quiet and conform. František Mikloško here in Bratislava, he told me something similar. He said that he's always tried to talk to liberals of goodwill because you can work and should work with people who may not agree with you on everything, but who are willing to be brave in resisting soft totalitarianism. What we've seen happen in America now, you're starting to see some people on the left who are true liberals. They may not share our faith, but they're willing to take serious risks to stand up against wokeness. I'm thinking of people like Barry Weiss. She is a young, secular Jewish lesbian who quit her job at the New York Times, even though she herself is a liberal, because she said she was sick and tired of watching what these bullies, these woke bullies, were doing to the newspaper. There are people like Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying. They're both atheists, both a couple who are on the political left, but they were driven out of their university because they refused to bend the knee to wokeness. These are people who do not share my faith, but I would much rather be standing with them on the front lines than with people who go to my church or who profess my faith, but who are too afraid to take a risk to defend it. So yeah, we have to make these alliances now, and it's probably a good reminder for me not to be so enthusiastic in my Christian advocacy that I alienate good men and women who will be willing to stand with me and defend people like Päivi Räisänen, who you saw earlier.
But do they say the same to Christians, that they are ready to unite with them?
Yeah, you know, Barry Weiss, believe it or not, has said that repeatedly. She was on Jordan Peterson's podcast recently talking about me. Barry told me that, she said 2 years ago, if you had said to me that Rod Dreher and I would be on the same side as anything, I wouldn't have believed you. But this is where we are. This is where the pressure of this time is taking us.
Tom asked the question, responsible promiscuity is the college dominant culture. Pleasure over any limits. All consensual sex is better than any frustration. What message have you found to be most effective with students to warn them?
To warn them about
warn them about that culture, that responsible promiscuity culture. Warning for them.
Yeah, you know, I haven't really talked about promiscuity with students. You know, when I have, I've told them the story of my own conversion, about how that was the thing that stood between me and Christ. I did not want to give up my sexual freedom. Not that I made use of it, but I thought it was my right as a red-blooded American of the late 20th century. But I realized that I could not be an honest, faithful Christian unless I was completely obedient to our Lord. And the day came when I had a pregnancy scare with some girl I hooked up with at a party, woke up drunk, we went to bed drunk, and she thought she might be pregnant. She said, "Don't worry, I'll get an abortion." I was 23. I said, "What? No, you can't. That would be a baby." And she said, "You can't tell me what to do." Well, I knew she was right, that I couldn't stop her from doing it. But it also, if she had an abortion, that would still be on my conscience because I had sinned. She wasn't pregnant, thank God, but I had 2 weeks to think about the seriousness of the way I was living. And I realized that it was time to get serious about God. And so when I became a Christian, a Catholic, I embraced chastity because that was the cross I had to carry. That was the thing that was hardest for me to get over. And it was very, very difficult. I had no support. I think my priests, I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, I think my priests were kind of embarrassed by me when I would go to confession and talk about this. But I did it because I knew what the alternative was. And what I found out, I used to pray for a wife if that was God's will, or for peace in my heart if it wasn't. And what I found over the next few years as I persevered in prayer, as difficult as it was, I began to grow in maturity, so that when I finally met, 3 years later, when I met the woman that I was meant to marry, I recognized her for the goodness that she represented, for who she was. And I don't think if I had not committed myself to faithful chastity and withdrawing from that world of all my peers, I don't think my heart would have been ready to recognize my wife when I met her. So I just tell them my own story that, look, it was hard for me, but there was no alternative. I knew the Lord had brought me out of Egypt, and I did not want to go back to Egypt. And he used the sacrifice I was willing to make of my own liberty, to my own sexual freedom, to prepare me for marriage. And thank God for it. I mean, because I was prepared. I was an immature man when I became a Catholic, and 3 or 4 years later, after practicing chastity and being obedient, I was a grown man ready for marriage, and I've been married for 24 years now, 3 kids.
Congratulations. There is one connected question, sort of. Anonymous ask if it's not the biggest problem if we not agree what's moral and what's not moral. Is it necessary to evolve to a situation that we will agree what's moral and not moral, or can we somehow avoid this problem of two moralities in the society?
You know, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre wrote a book called After Virtue, published in 1982, I think it was, and he talked about how we in the West have reached a place like that can be compared to the collapse of the Roman Empire. And our problem, he says, is that we can no longer agree on morality because we don't agree on the source of morality. When everybody in our countries were Christian, even if they weren't very good Christians, but they believed that the moral code taught in the Bible was true, then it didn't mean that we had no problems, but we at least had a common source of morality that allowed us to work our problems out. Well, that's gone now. And I think so much of the irreconcilability of the culture war, the fact that we keep arguing and never seem to solve anything, comes from the fact that we have such radically different views of where our morality comes from. And if we can't agree on a common source of morality, then it only becomes a matter of power. And I think we're seeing that happen now in the case of what's happening with Hungary, with its the recent law forbidding propaganda, advocacy for LGBT to minors. I think that this is perfectly normal, and not only as a Christian, but just even if I didn't agree with Hungary's stance, I would say it's their right, it's their country. Why can't they decide what they want for their kids to see and not? But the European Union disagrees, and it is trying to force its own very liberal secular morality onto this country that doesn't want it. And I don't know how that's going to end up. I really don't. But I believe that it becomes a matter of power, not of reason, but of power. The European Union chief, Ursula von der Leyen, said today that she was going to use the European Commission to try to punish Hungary. And that's not reason. That's the raw exercise of power. And I think we're going to see more and more things like that. We saw it with Päivi Räisänen earlier in the previous presentation, in which here's a woman who is a longtime member of parliament in Finland, and she is under criminal charge for tweeting out a Bible verse that was perceived as critical of homosexuals. You know, this is a naked exercise of power against this woman. This is coming more and more and more.
What's the alternative? Kolakovic himself, he was not only critical of communism and fascism or Nazism, he was also critical of liberal theory. And here's the question, what do you think should be solution? Shall we establish some sort of Christian political regime, theocratic regime?
I don't think that's even possible. You know, in America now you have some very conservative Catholics, intellectuals, who are talking about integralism, you know, a conservative Catholic regime. I think that is nothing but an intellectual exercise, because even if America were a majority Catholic country, which it's not, but even if it were, most Catholics don't agree with some pretty basic things that the Catholic Church teaches. So they would first need to convert the culture and make the culture more Catholic before they can make the politics more Catholic. I don't have a satisfying answer to that question, because I live in a pluralistic country where you have people of so many different religions, different races, and I want to live in peace with these people, with my neighbors who don't agree with me. And I think that classical liberalism is probably the best, for all its problems, is probably the best we have. But I don't know if that it's possible without a shared religious faith or shared source of morality. You know, I don't think the state should get involved in everybody's decisions. That's totalitarianism, to go deep into people's decisions. But at the same time, I think about something one of our founding fathers, John Adams, famously said. talking about the U.S. Constitution, he said, our Constitution is made for moral and religious people. It is insufficient for any other. And he said that if people lose a sense of common religion, that they will tear through the Constitution like a whale in a net. And I think we're living to see that happen right now in America. And this is why I fear that we will have some form of dictatorship at some point.
American liberalism is strengthened by position, or used to be strengthened by position of USA in the world as a dominant hegemonial power. Now it's changing, and it will change. China will replace US as dominant power. What will it mean for American liberalism?
This is one of the things that drives me crazy about American liberalism. They don't see how they're weakening our own country's position in the world, and are returning the people in our country against each other. Critical race theory is something that is enormously important in America right now. It's teaching the American people not to focus on what unites us, but rather what divides us along the lines of race. It's extraordinary. Why would you do this in a country where there is no... Right now, white people make up 60%, but pretty soon, like within 20 or 30 years, there will be no one dominant race in America. So why in the world would you encourage people to think about, in terms of race, the line between good and evil goes between the races? But this is the way the left is not even thinking about things like this. They're just pushing on blindly. I think that they are destroying the capacity of America to govern itself. I'll talk again about the military. The U.S. military had a recent recruiting ad which showed a woman who is some Army officer who runs a Patriot missile battery, and she was talking about her story about how she entered the military, and she said she was raised by two lesbian moms.
Raise the mic.
I'm sorry. She was raised by two lesbian moms, and she said, I went to pride parades when I was a kid, and now I see my service in the military as another way of fighting for freedom. Well, you compare that to the military recruiting ads in Russia and China, and your jaw drops. You can't believe that this is what America has become. But I think that we have become, this is what we're turning ourselves into. And frankly, I would be happy if America fought fewer wars in the world. After Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm ready for us to stop fighting wars. At the same time, though, if we are falling apart internally, and that cannot be good for Europe, and it's certainly not good for America.
There is a question about Trump and the left. Why do you think the left in the US became so fast, so radical during Trump administration? And I would add, does it have to do something with Trump?
It has a lot to do with Trump, because he violated so many settled norms of how presidents behave, and it frightened people. It frightened people on the left. I was talking to a reporter for the New York Times not long ago, and I said, can you tell me why, she's on the left herself, but I said, can you tell me why the newsrooms of the major newspapers became so radical so fast and threw away classical liberalism and now have embraced this radical left-wing ideology? And she said Trump. And she wasn't blaming him so much, but saying that it scared the left so much that they thought anything we do to fight against him is legitimate. So they threw their own standards away to fight Trump. And so what we're going to see, I'm afraid, on the right, is people on the right saying, we can't follow our own standards anymore. Anything we do to fight the left is justifiable. This is how you end up with civil war. And the one good thing I can say about Joe Biden is that he is normal. I mean, I hate the fact that what he's doing. He's a very good politician. He knows how to use power to change things, and I hate that. But I appreciate that he doesn't have drama. I mean, the right doesn't really, I'm on the right. We don't criticize Biden. We don't focus on Biden because there's not much there to criticize. He keeps it very, very quiet. And And this, I think, is probably helping his party out a lot. There are a lot of things to criticize the Democrats for, but Trump was such a lightning rod. He made the left so angry, and he thought he was achieving a victory when he made the left mad. We have a phrase in America, owning the libs. It means basically to humiliate the left. And there are far too many people on my side, on the right in America, who think that all you have to do is own the libs and you've won. Well, guess what happened? Trump had 4 years in office. 2 of those years he had a fully Republican Congress, and he didn't do a lot. We got great judges, I'm glad of that, but he spent so much time owning the libs, giving speeches that made liberals mad, sending out tweets that made them mad, when he should have been doing things like what Biden is doing and actually changing things. You disagree, I can tell.
It seems, yeah, I would disagree. But tomorrow we will make interview and
Okay.
we will keep it for tomorrow. You mentioned that the worst oppressor in ourselves is ourselves, and the real tyranny begins with the ruling class frightens us to oppression. Is not also the case? Is it not also the case of all COVID fear-mongering and the subsequent removal of civil liberties?
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is about COVID hysteria. If COVID hysteria was not also, if it somehow did not test it, our common sense.
Yeah. Boy, that's such a difficult question now, because so many people even today are sure that they know everything that happened with COVID. And I really don't. One thing I hated at first when COVID first came is that people, in my country at least, took it entirely as a political matter. They did not want to make any, either they did not want to make any sacrifices at all for the common good, or they completely freaked out in the opposite direction and were willing to impose heavy sacrifices on everybody. Well, now we're a year and a half into this thing, and we're finding out that some of the things that Dr. Anthony Fauci said were not really true. We're finding out that the Wuhan lab leak theory, which was denounced by Facebook and everybody, was probably true. So I don't honestly know what to believe, but I do know this. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, talked about how the loss of belief in authorities, traditional authorities, was part of what paved the way for totalitarianism. Well, let me tell you, the US government and the US Health Service has lost a tremendous amount of authority over the way it's handled COVID. And right now, I mean, there's a lot of volatility in America because people don't know what they can believe. And people have sacrificed greatly for COVID. Now they're wondering, was it worth it? Did we have to do that? What did they know that they didn't tell us?
We need to finish, but I have one more question. There are many other questions in the computer, and some people also want to ask. Please come to Rod after all and ask him directly. But because tonight we somehow want to remember Silvester Krčméry, tomorrow we will remember the day he made the speech in the court. Be brief. What impressed you the most? What touched your heart when you read the Krčméry's story?
His speech, for one thing, that brave address. But more than the thing that has stayed with me has been him saying that he accepted his suffering as God's probe. I've thought about that in my own life. I remember when I was sitting in my own house a year ago under COVID lockdown, we were all suffering so much loneliness, anger, confusion. And even in my own parish, my own church, we didn't know what to think. People were angry at each other. I thought about Dr. Krčméry, and I said, look, being locked down in your house under COVID is not like being in a communist prison, but can't I at least live by his wisdom? Can't, instead of being angry and feeling sorry for myself and looking for somebody to blame, can't I just say, what is God trying to show me here? What can I do? How can I learn to love God more? How can I deepen my repentance? How can I help other people? And that really calmed me. So that's when I talk about how this man, Dr. Krčméry, he was not only a hero of freedom and of the faith, he also gave us a truly practical way to live everyday life. And I often find myself, whenever I'm faced with some difficulty in life and something that makes me angry or depressed, I always think about him going into prison and what he wrote in This Saved Us. And I have found, believe it or not, of all the people I interviewed or books I read in preparing my book, Live Not by Lies, believe it or not, I found Dr. Silvester Krčméry to be the one dissident who meant the most to me personally, even more than Solzhenitsyn, because I felt very close to Dr. Krčméry. I felt like I could relate to him. And tomorrow I'm going to go to his grave and pray.
Dear friends, Dreher.
Once again, thanks to our dear guest, Mr. Dreher. It was such a joy to have you. Thank you. Also, thanks to Jaroslav Daniška for hosting the discussion. Please give him also a round of applause. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, this has been tonight's last event, but the festival goes on. Tomorrow we will continue with one discussion that's titled Women or Women That Are Not Afraid. Please note that it starts at 6 p.m., not 8 p.m. as it was originally announced. So 6 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. I would also like to invite you on our special to our special Saturdays event. It's called Exodus Retreat, and it's the day spent with the content manager, I believe, of the Exodus 90 initiative. So all the information can be found on our website. Don't forget to visit our shop and see some of the books that we have in store. I'd like to highlight one particular piece, which is Verbum magazine, which you definitely shouldn't overlook. You can find some refreshments there as well. Follow us also on social media or subscribe to our newsletter to keep you updated on all the news about our events and activities. In SLH, we often say one can change the world but cannot do that alone. If you like to join our mission and help us to change the world, please consider supporting our cause by participating in our crowdfunding campaign that we have launched. And again, you will find all the necessary information about it on our website. We would like to thank the ones that are already supporting us. That means our main partners, which are company Ploud and law firm Lisnaroško and Partners. Thanks also to our main media partners, Denník Štandard, Nové mesto, and konzervatívny denník Postoj. Last but not least, once again, thank you for keeping valid pandemic measures, and please carry on with it until you will leave this venue. And that's everything from my side. Thank you for being here. We will see you tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you once again, and have a good night. Goodbye.